Sup nerds and welcome back to the Helpware Nerds podcast. It's the big one, the one we've been counting down all week. It's our 50th episode. Thank you to everyone that's got us here this far. Thank you to all the subscribers we've got over on all the channels and social medias. I can't believe we've actually made it this far, to be honest. This was just a little bit of a passion project that was started on a whim, literally through a suggestion by my mum, as she got kind of bored listening to me talk about all these nerdy passions. And she just threw out, why don't you do a podcast? And so me and Rob and then the nerds of the round table ended up doing it. It all culminated. And 50 episodes later, we've been doing it and bringing you guys entertainment, which you guys seem to love. And to be honest, that is great for me. I'm glad that we've made it this far. And thank you to everyone. Thank you to the nerds of the round table. Thank you to all of you that have participated. Thanks to all the special guests that have showed up. Thanks to Emily Woods for the interview she did on the Doctor Who review. That was all. This has been a wild ride so far, and I hope we continue down this path for the next 50 and we get to our 100th episode. That would be a dream come true. Like, this is a wild ride for me. If we ever make it that far, I don't know what. But with that being said, I think we should actually get into the crux of this episode. And this episode was an idea that was thrown out by top nerd of the round table, Ashley, before she even joined the round table. It was the comment she left on our first ever episode of the podcast before she even joined us. And that's disability in the Nerdverse. So let's get into it. Well, you guys, if you've been around the podcast long enough, know that the majority of us here at HWN have disabilities or know someone with a disability. I myself have cerebral palsy. So this is a big thing for us. This is one of those things that we really do like to talk about because it's one of the main reasons, at least for myself, I don't want to speak for the others, why I became a nerd and why this all ended up becoming a thing. It's the nerd space that allowed me to accept the parts of myself that were different from the other people that I was seeing in my life. And watching the superheroes also go through this, or book characters go through things like this, helped immensely solidify that. And yeah, these adaptations and portrayals, whether they were outright disabled with their conditions or just their superpowers being allegories for disability, really did help. So with all that set up, let's actually get into the first part. And we're going to talk about something that we've talked about immensely on the podcast at this point. And that's going to be one of my favorite books, adaptations, excluding the movies, Percy Jackson. So if you know anything about Percy Jackson, you'll have come across the fact that Percy himself is a demigod, obviously. He's the son of Poseidon. He has water powers. But on the flip side, he has ADHD and dyslexia. While this was a part of the story, wasn't a main focal point, it was mentioned in the first book, and it's not just Percy that has ADHD and dyslexia, it's all demigods have ADHD and dyslexia. And the reason why is because their brains are hardwired for combat and ancient Greek instead of English and sitting still like regular mortals. Now, Rick didn't just pull this out of nowhere and come up with this concept. He actually came up with the idea through his son and based Percy's disabilities on his son partially. In a Q&A, he said that it was partially based on his son and experiences he had as a teacher. So I don't want to fully put it on that, but that's what he said in a Q&A. So you can see that Rick didn't just come up with this idea out of nowhere just to give Percy a flaw in quotation marks. He had the idea to help his son, as it's helped many people understand or come up with a way to with their condition and stuff like that, and some of his students as well. So that is a really good avenue for Percy. Now, the fan consensus, from what I've been able to gather through looking into this for the podcast and all that, and my own personal opinion on this, is that I personally think Percy Jackson does a really good job illustrating this and turning what some might see as a weakness into a strength. It says to a person that yes, your skills and things aren't suited for the average, mundane world. However, that doesn't mean they don't have their benefits. You just haven't found where your specific things fit yet. And when you do, you'll feel a part of it. And that's very empowering. However, there are some criticisms to this, and more so in the modern era than there were when I was growing up. But it doesn't mean that they weren't around when I was growing up. And that's that Rick's interpretation of these two very real conditions were outdated and have subsequently become even more outdated as times progressed. Now, you can see that Rick's looking at it through a specific lens, and obviously, when you look at something through a specific lens, that means that it won't encapsulate everything, and time does move on, and people's understanding of specific conditions evolves, changes, and progresses. So I can't fully fault the books for not being perfect when it comes to their interpretation of ADHD and dyslexia. I still think that the message of empowerment that they put on people and the acceptance that they've been able to give, not just myself, but countless others throughout the nerdverse and nerd space, is tantamount to the negative side of it. Like, it outweighs it exponentially. That doesn't mean that the criticisms don't have any weight at all. They do. If you are looking at it solely from a learned side and objectively, then yeah, if you're going to look at it to try and learn about dyslexia and ADHD, probably don't get your information from these books or TV shows or movies, because they're not the best source on showing you how these conditions would actually work. Now, I'm not an expert in these areas either. I do have an educational psychology degree, so I do know a little bit about these conditions through that, but I'm no expert, and neither was Rick or the people behind Percy Jackson. So you can't hold them to educational standards. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't criticize them. I'm not trying to say that the criticisms aren't valid. It might come across that way. It's just that I'm very passionate about this interpretation because, as I said, it's one of the things that helped me as a kid. So if it does feel like I'm defending this a lot, that'll be why. But I can see where the negative sides are coming from. I can see that having outdated and misinformed interpretations can be detrimental. I can also see the other side that people tend to bring up when they argue about Percy's conditions being magical, which is that they turn the disability from being a disability to a superpower, and that can have, in some cases, detriment to a person by them expecting themselves to also have that superpower. Now, for me, I personally think that's a rare case. But again, I'm no expert in this field, so take everything I'm saying with a pinch of salt. This is literally just my thoughts, feelings, and interpretations of everything that I've read and talked about Percy Jackson. When you look at Percy Jackson, though, you can also look at the other disabilities that come into play when it comes to Percy Jackson. And this is where even I have to look at it and think, okay, you can give benefit of the doubt to the Percy side of the argument. However, when you look, Grover and Mr. Brunner, later revealed to be Chiron. If you haven't read that far in the books, I'm sorry for the spoiler. But their disguises are literally faking disabilities. Now, they do have their own issues with accessibility due to the species that they are, being a satyr and a centaur, respectively, in their own worlds. However, in the concept of Percy Jackson, Grover fakes a limp, and Mr. Brunner, Chiron, fakes needing a wheelchair to be able to go out into the mortal world. This can have some negative connotations to it because there are real world problems of people faking disabilities to get around certain things, such as parking restrictions and when it was a thing, I'm not sure if it's still a thing, but fast track lines at Disneyland and other resorts like that, as well as countless other things such as benefit scams and stuff like that. So, while I don't believe that that was the intention at all, it is a bit of a murky thing to have two very prominent and heroic characters faking medical conditions to subsequently fit in the mortal world. When we've seen what the mist in Percy Jackson can actually cover up, it doesn't seem like it would be necessary to do that. And it feels, unlike Percy's dyslexia and ADHD, it feels like those two were shoehorned in with little thought to the ramifications of what they actually did mean by doing so. And while I can, like I said, while I can give Rick the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the ADHD and dyslexia being slightly outdated or from a specific lens, as he mainly did focus on his own experience with the conditions, when it comes to that, that's a bit of a bad move that he made there. So when we look at the way that Percy Jackson does disability, one thing that we need to look at is the social model of disability, because this is a framework of disability that focuses on society rather than the individual. And I feel like the way that Percy Jackson looks at ADHD, dyslexia, and Grover and Mr. Brunner's conditions, I feel like it lends itself more to that than person-centered. And the basic idea of the social model of disability, so that we don't have to dive fully deep into it, is that people's disabilities and conditions aren't the main issue. It's the way that society is constructed around them. So if the barriers to a disabled person aren't themselves, it's society. So take, for example, Mr. Brunner's in his wheelchair and he goes to the museum. It's the first chapter. There's a scene where we see the ramp. But take out that ramp, the barrier would be the stairs. The social model would say that It's not Mr. Brunner's condition that's caused the issue. It's the fact that there was no ramp or lift to accommodate for that that's made the issue. In layman's terms, basically. So it's not about the individual, it's about the barriers. And I feel like Percy Jackson, when we look at Percy Jackson, it's best to look at it through this lens because that's where you can see most of its strengths and limitations. Because, again, when you look at the barriers and things like that, you look at the barriers that would be put in place for someone with dyslexia and ADHD by society. They're removed, Percy and Annabeth, once they get to Camp Half-Blood. Because Camp Half-Blood is geared for their demigod side, where the dyslexia and ADHD doesn't really have any bearing, because it's their superpower there. Ancient Greek and battle stamina is a key part of being a demigod. So they need those attributes to be able to function at Camp Half-Blood. However, once they get out of Camp Half-Blood, those disabilities return because they're back in the mortal world, and those things that were strengths at Camp Half-Blood are now weaknesses. And I feel like that's why the social model is more representative of Percy Jackson. Does that make sense? Now, you may disagree with the research that I did and the take that I've took from that as well. So do let me know down in the comments wherever you're listening to this or over here on YouTube if you do disagree with that and you have a better take. With that being said, though, I do overall think Percy Jackson did have a boost in acceptance and people finding their people within the neurodivergent dyslexia ADHD space. And I know that I've been able to meet people who were able to come to terms with their own conditions through Percy Jackson. And we've been able to have fantastic conversations about Percy Jackson, but then about why it was so liberating. At school, one of the things that my groups used to talk about was Percy Jackson and how it felt for us. So Percy Jackson, to me, gets the overall stamp of approval as a good thing for the disability in the Nerdverse. It's not the only thing in the Nerdverse to touch on disability. There are multiple things. There are multiple negative things, such as, and I'm not going to go fully into this, but this is one thing that I will mention. Now, I don't know if everybody remembers this show. It's a niche show, I think, but Heroes, the show where everybody got their powers during I think it was a solar eclipse. It might have been a lunar eclipse, but an eclipse. Anyway, there was a character in that had cerebral palsy like me, and her disability disappeared when she got her superpowers. That, for me, was a negative representation, disability representation, because the superpowers fixed them, which shouldn't be how you do that. If you're going to introduce a disabled character to your mythos, the superpowers shouldn't then undo the disability. They should aid them in. This is, again, my personal opinion, but I don't think they should undo them. I think that is a detriment, and that's all I really have to say on Heroes with that. There were some ways that it did work with Heroes, that they had other characters where it did work, but that case specifically always rubbed me the wrong way, and I thought this was the best place to talk about it. I don't know if it rubbed me the wrong way specifically because I have cerebral palsy and that was the condition they were portraying, and then suddenly she got super speed and she didn't have cerebral palsy anymore, or at least wasn't affected by it. It was kind of, here's a magical answer to your disability. I, I didn't like that. But moving on from that, we're going to talk about the X-Men. Now, I know people might be up in arms and being like, what do you mean the X-Men? The X-Men's mutant metaphor can fit many different oppressed groups. Obviously, it originally started out as a metaphor for the civil rights movement, and it obviously still works for that today. It doesn't fit perfectly. It doesn't fit into any of these groups perfectly. I don't think it ever will, but it does still work for that too. Then we have the whole thing where it's pivoted a little bit from that, but still sticks with that. And we've got the LGBTQIA community and how the mutant metaphor is used to represent that. And it also represents disability as well, and the way that people with disabilities can be treated as a marginalized group and things like that. This is where I relate more to the X-Men as opposed to the other two for obvious reasons. But the X-Men, if you feel like you find yourself in the X-Men, then the mutant metaphor probably worked for you for whatever reason you were able to find yourself within the X-Men. I think I mentioned it either in my nerdy origin or in our trailer, but when I was a kid, my mum used the X-Men's mutant metaphor to explain to me why my disability made me different from everybody else, but in a way that made me feel empowered rather than feeling like I was different in a negative way. She used it to relate it to some of my favorite superheroes because I was a massive X-Men the Animated Series fan. So she connected it to that. And she said that while they were superpowered, I had my own superpower. And because of that, it allowed me, and then things like Percy Jackson, it allowed me to realize, yes, I'm different, but that doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. It's like what Storm says in X-Men 3 when she specifically, I'm not going to do the full speech, but when she basically specifically tells them that there's nothing wrong with them. That is how the X-Men feel to me and how they equate to disability to me. But there are specific stories that fit every single thing. Like if you look at Days of Future Past, for example, that is a clear allegory for the Holocaust. We literally have mutant concentration camps. So you can't tell me there's no parallels there. When we get down to the legacy virus, and you can see the parallels with the AIDS epidemic and how it was believed to only target the LGBTQIA community. Now, we know that that is false in the modern era. However, it was a widely held belief at the time of the epidemic. And the legacy virus clearly parallels that, with it specifically targeting mutants. And then there is the cure, which I think can parallel multiple things. I think it can be like trying to fix disabilities. It can also be conversion camps, a way to move people from being LGBTQ to fitting the white picket fence, stereotypical nuclear family. However, while that has many parallels, I do like it when you look at it through a disability lens and trying to fix disabilities and make them quote unquote normal. There's also Warren Worthington III and how his transformation from angel to archangel can clearly fit body dysmorphia. As he was mutilated, his wings were changed and he was completely ripped from his body. And then, well, it was literally, it's clearly an allegory for it if you look at it through an objective lens. In X2, it's not really comic books, but in X-Men 2, the movie, the conversation Bobby has with his parents where his mother asks him to try not being a mutant is clearly a allegory for parents trying to ask their kids not to be LGBTQ. So that's what I'm trying to say, where the mutant metaphor can fit multiple different things. Now, obviously, for us in this, we're talking specifically disability. I just wanted to get it out of the way and make it very clear that I'm aware that the X-Men aren't solely for disability. The UNF4 is an umbrella. It fits so many different communities. But when we look at disability, there are multiple characters that outright have disabilities. Professor X is the most notable. When you think about disability and X-Men, that's the one that will come to your mind straight away. His most notable appearance is him in the wheelchair. It's what most people will think of. Though he hasn't actually been in the wheelchair for decades, it is what most people think of, and a lot of people will think of Patrick Stewart in the wheelchair. I know that that's what pops into my head the most when I think about Professor X. Even though I've read most X-Men comics and watched the animated series multiple times, Patrick Stewart's portrayal is the one that pops into my head first. Then there is clearly Rogue not being able to make physical contact with anybody. That is a disability. Wolverine having PTSD is mental health and falls under the disability definition. So there is countless mental health issues within the X-Men that would fall under that umbrella. Too many to count, but most notably Wolverine and his PTSD. You have Scott Summers and his laser vision or optic blasts, if you are more in the know, and he has brain damage, which is why he can't turn those off. So there are countless disabilities there. Wade Wilson's healing factor may cause it so that he doesn't have many things, but he is physically deformed because of the experiments that were done on him. Beast is forever changed into a beast, so could be considered a deformity. You have Beak, who is literally a Birdman. There are so many. Leech, again, a physical mutation. Physical mutations could quite easily fit the deformity bracket of disability and things like that. But Professor X also kind of falls into what I was saying about heroes, where powers are used to undo or circumvent disabilities, because Professor X used his telepathy. I believe it was to move into Phantom X's body. Now, correct me in the comments if I got that wrong. I might be wrong at this point, but I believe that's how Professor X can walk again, which kind of undoes the paralysis, even though it's not technically his original body. But my point stands. His powers undid the disability. And he is one of the most notable disabled characters in comics, alongside, I would argue, Barbara Gordon when she was Oracle after the Killing Joke, which got retconned, well, not retconned, but undone when she became Batgirl again. Again, undoing things. I know comic book continuity isn't stagnant and things get undone all the time, but that is another thing. You made a character disabled and undid it. Sometimes it's a bit, did you do it very, very similar to Mr. Brunner and Grover? Did you do it for the gimmick rather than for actual representation? And that's when we get the bad side of her disability representation and disability in the Nerdverse. Obviously, there are a bunch of notable characters in the Nerdverse with disabilities, from Clint Barton to Daredevil. And while we could spend all day going through every single disabled character within the Nerdverse, I don't really feel like we need to do that. I feel like just talking about what we have been talking about is really hammering home the point that I'm trying to make here. That the mutant metaphor and Percy Jackson's representations do something for people with disabilities to help them understand and find themselves in these mediums. Daredevil does the same, so does Echo and Clint Barton, along with all these countless other characters, from Barbara Gordon being Oracle and when she was Oracle, to every other character that comes forward with a disability in comic books, TV, and books. There's just too many to count and too many to talk about that we'd be remiss in not mentioning them. But I do feel like the ones that I've focused on were the ones that impacted me and the ones that I feel like I could speak to on a personal level. Now, you probably have your own that helped you find yours and your space within the Nerdverse and come to terms with whatever you needed to come to terms with in your own lives. And that's the beauty of the Nerdverse. It it there's always something for you to find yourself in, and whether the equality is there in real life, seeing your favorite heroes or favorite book characters or favorite TV show characters struggle with the same things you are, and then finding their people and finding that equality within their people, even if that equality isn't there in their world. See, the X-Men, for example, lets you know that that does exist somewhere out there for you. It might not exist where you want it to, but in the wider space. But there's always the people that you can find that will help you to be the you want to be. And while society at large might not be there yet, there are always your people. And for me, you guys and the nerds of the round table are my people, my X-Men, my Camp Half-Blood. So, with that being said, thank you for getting us to 50 episodes and being supportive. And thank you again, Nerds of the Roundtable, for all the support you've given me. And with that being said, we'll end this video on a high note. And as always, stay happy, stay healthy, and most of all, stay nerdy. And you're always included here.